16 years ago this week, on July 13th, 2005, the UPN network, which was then the home of Smackdown, requested that WWE pull the Muhammad Hassan character from the show after a huge controversy erupted the week prior. Hassan, really more than anything, was a victim of poor timing. The week before, on the July 7th episode of Smackdown, Undertaker had a match against Hassan's manager, Daivari. After the match, Hassan dropped to his knees. He began to pray when 5 men in black ski masks ran in and they beat down the Undertaker. And one of them pulled out a piece of piano wire, began choking him, and they carried Daivari's body from the ring, in Taz's words, like a martyr. Right? This is the language they use. This is what they wanted you to think. It was clear what they were going for. And if this aired on any other night, nobody outside of the wrestling bubble, I think, would have said a word. But the angle aired on the same day as the London terror bombings. So it wasn't a case of WWE doing this angle to try to exploit the attacks, hours after they happened. The show had already been taped a few days before. Now, UPN did air a statement warning the segment would be controversial, but what they should have done is just cut the segment. They had enough time to either have WWE film something and stick it in there, or just air an old match, but they should have cut it. And they didn't. And the mainstream media jumped all over him. And it wasn't WWE that paid a price for it. It was Mark Kopani, who portrayed Muhammad Hassan, who did nothing wrong. He did his job. He was a young guy, green guy, playing a character on television, doing his job, playing a part. And he was banished from Smackdown. I would imagine USA Network felt the same way, which is why they didn't just move him over to Raw. He had already been on Raw. He was literally just moved over from Raw to Smackdown. So either they didn't want to move him right back to Raw, because creatively they had just gotten him off the show, or again, maybe USA didn't want to have any part of this either. But the angle itself was really stupid, and it was done for shock value. Hassan's character, and here's why it was stupid. Hassan's character was he was an Arab American who protested the prejudice. Remember all those opening vignettes when he first debuted? He's an Arab American who is protesting the prejudices that Americans had towards other Arab Americans after 9/11. They were playing off real life, and not only was that a real thing, but I think it continues to be a real thing to this day. So that's how he was introduced, and how people looked down at him based on how he looked and how he dressed. That was the character. Until now, where they have, in this angle here, a bunch of nameless, faceless terrorists, basically, run in to beat up the Undertaker, all led by Muhammad Hassan, which goes against everything the character was about. It was done purely for shock value, and they picked the wrong night to do it, and it bit them on the ass. But it also killed Kopani's career. UPN decided they didn't want him on the show anymore. He was scheduled to wrestle the Undertaker at the Great American Bash in a number 1 contenders match, with the winner challenging Batista for the World Championship at Summerslam in the nation's capital and Batista's hometown of Washington, D.C. Instead, Undertaker beat him at the pay-per-view, gave him a last ride powerbomb from the stage down through the stage, basically onto the concrete, to write off the character for good. They sent him and Daivari back to Ohio Valley Wrestling, and then ultimately they released him. So he didn't do anything wrong. He ends up losing his push. He gets sent back down to developmental, and then he gets fired. I'd say he got a raw deal. Even if you didn't like the character, I think it's fair to say he got a raw deal. Meanwhile, Undertaker lost a match on Smackdown, even though he won at the pay-per-view. He went on to lose a match on Smackdown to JBL. That made JBL the number 1 contender to Batista's title at SummerSlam, which would be a rematch from their title match that they had at the Great American Bash. after his release, Kopani retired from wrestling. That was it. His career was over. He was damaged goods. And also, it may have just soured him, frankly, on the whole experience. So he transitioned away from wrestling into education. He went back to college first, and then he went on to become a history teacher and a high school principal. And Kopani, in interviews since, and he told this to Chris Van Vliet, in fact, last year, said the plan as he heard it after the fact was for him to beat The Undertaker at that pay-per-view and then go on to SummerSlam and wrestle Batista and win the World Championship at SummerSlam in 2004. I'm sorry, 2005, not 2004. It was never explicitly said to him that he was going to win the title because they wouldn't have made that decision probably that far out in advance. But he would have gone on to SummerSlam at the very least to challenge for the championship. And Bruce Pritchard has also said that was the plan, that it would have been Batista against Hassan in DC. And the idea of him winning the title was at least being discussed. It had not been decided upon, but it had at least been discussed internally. I can 100% believe that it would have been Hassan against Batista at that pay-per-view. Because the character was a heat magnet, and he already had a number one contenders match already set up. All he had to do was beat The Undertaker. It would have been far too appealing for them not to give him a world title shot in DC of all places. Now, would he have won the championship? And if so, how well would he have done in the role? I mean, we'll never know because he was never given the chance. He had only debuted in wrestling in 2002 when he went right to OVW. He was still very inexperienced. But in his short time on TV, look at who he got to work with. He got to work with Hulk Hogan. He got to work with Shawn Michaels. He got to work with The Undertaker. This was not some little mid-card character. Although he did get pinned for the first time and squashed by John Cena on Raw right before he got drafted over to Smackdown. Cena was the WWE champion at that time. That was his big send-off from the Red Brand. But if Vince McMahon would put the WWF title on Sergeant Slaughter, the Iraqi sympathizer, because he thought it would be great heel heat, and then they could have the American hero beat him and get the belt back, you don't think he wouldn't have at least considered the same thing with Hassan? Of course he would have. They put the fucking belt on Great Khali 2 years later. Of course they would have done it. But he got screwed, Hassan did, through no fault of his own. And speaking of that, speaking of the Great Khali, 14 years ago this week, the perfect segue, at the Smackdown taping in Laredo, Texas on July 17th, 2007, Edge was forced to forfeit the World Heavyweight Championship due to a torn pec that he had suffered a week earlier, which kept him sidelined until Survivor Series that November. That vacancy would not last long, because later on in the show, the Great Khali won a 20-man battle royal to become the new World Heavyweight Champion. And do not ask Dave Batista about Great Khali holding the big gold belt, because I've heard him talk about it before. I think it makes him physically sick. I don't know that he has anything against Khali as a person, but when I've heard Batista talk about Khali as a world champion in the past, you could hear the pain, the legitimate pain in his voice. 10 years ago this week, you believe it's been 10 years? July 17th, 2011, Money in the Bank from the Allstate Arena in Chicago, Illinois. Daniel Bryan wins the SmackDown Money in the Bank ladder match. Alberto Del Dipshit wins the Raw Money in the Bank ladder match. Christian wins the World Heavyweight title from Randy Orton on a disqualification. He spat in Randy Orton's face. Per the stipulation, the title could change hands on a DQ, and I think it was Orton who kicked him low. And I've never in my life that I can recall heard this kind of loud positive reaction for a disqualification low blow finish. But that led to Christian winning back the World Heavyweight Championship for the final time. But the thing that this pay-per-view is most remembered for, and rightfully so, and especially being in Chicago, is CM Punk against John Cena for the WWE Championship. Now, CM Punk was not happy. He was not happy in his role in the company at that point. He was still doing the whole straight edge society thing. And he was ready to leave. His contract was legitimately coming up on this date, July 17th. He was out the door. He had already made the decision, I'm going to leave. This ain't working out for me. And he had a title match scheduled with John Cena. And it went right down to the wire. People didn't know if he was going to re-sign or not. They were teasing it like, I'm going to win the championship and I'm going to take the title and go somewhere else. That was the whole pipe bomb promo in Vegas when he sat on the stage and he talked about how I'm going to win the title and maybe I'll bring it to Ring of Honor. Maybe I'll go back to New Japan, or I'll go to New Japan Pro Wrestling, right? That's really what kicked all this off, was the pipe bomb. And it led to this event here in Chicago. And what it led to is one of the greatest matches in the history of that entire company. It's one of my favorite matches of all time. This could not have happened in a better place than Chicago. Punk came out, he got a hero's welcome. Little did they know that he had signed a new contract with the company that night, backstage, I believe it was, at the building. He had made the decision, he finally put pen to paper, and he re-signed with the company. But they were still playing it up like he hadn't, and that at midnight, he'd be a free agent, possibly with the title. So a lot of people probably thought he's not going to win because he's leaving. But he went out there, he got a hero's welcome. John Cena, my God, the heat that this guy had. He kept his head down when he walked to the ring. He wouldn't even make eye contact with anybody in the crowd. It was the closest thing since he made his entrance at the Hammerstein Ballroom for the match at One Night Stand against Rob Van Dam. When he kept his head down, he held the belt up in the air. That's the kind of heat he got in the building that night. Now magnify those 2,500 people in New York City to whatever they had this night. I think it was probably 12 or 13,000. I mean, from the first chord of his music when it hit, the boos, you could feel it reverberate through your body, and I'm just watching it from home on TV. I'm not even there in the building. They had a great match, some great dramatic near falls, especially at one point when it looked like Punk might tap out in the STF, but he got out of it. And then it built to the end where Punk hit the GTS and Cena fell out of the ring. And here comes Vince McMahon and Johnny Ace, trying to do what they can, hopefully to preserve the championship and keep the championship safe and sound here in this company. Cena knocks down Johnny Ace. He walks over to Vince McMahon and says, no, we're not going to do it like this. He slides back into the ring, right into the clutches of CM Punk, who drops him with a GTS. And he gets the 3. And CM Punk, for the first time, is WWE Champion. He'd held the World Heavyweight title a couple of times, but was never WWE Champion. He was never the featured guy in this company. And now he was on top of the world. And Vince McMahon tried to send Del Dipshit out to go cash in his money in the bank. He got kicked in the head. Punk went to go leave through the crowd. He blew a kiss to Vince McMahon. He went up and he celebrated in the crowd and walked right out of the building and right out of the company in storyline with the championship. And as great as all of this was, it was like magic watching this match. It was such a pleasure to watch this match and just everybody hanging on to every near fall the way they did. They played this perfectly, but it could have been so much better coming out of the show. They should have kept Punk out a little bit longer. They could have kept or come up with some kind of interim idea if they needed another match to do at SummerSlam. Really sell it. Keep him out a little bit longer. Show him going to a Cubs game, sitting at Wrigley Field or with the title. Have him pop up at various independent shows. Allow him to go pop up at a Ring of Honor show and have the WWE title with him. They really could have played this up so much better than they did, but they got lazy. And he was back on television very, very quickly. Far too quickly. Cena had a belt because in the meantime they had crowned the new champion. Punk showed up, so now they have dueling titles. And they went on to have the match at SummerSlam, which Punk won. It was the one with Triple H as the referee, but then Punk, of course, got fucked over by Kevin Nash. It was all downhill. This whole story was all downhill. Kevin Nash powerbombs him. Actually, powerbombed him a whole bunch of times on TV. They never did get their match done. He wrestled Triple H. He lost to Triple H. There was nobody more white hot in wrestling at that point in the fall of 2011 than CM Punk. He did eventually get the belt back. He did eventually turn heel. He did some big things in that company. But you think about the summer of Punk. If you're a CM Punk fan back from the ROH days, you think of Ring of Honor. This was a different kind of summer of Punk. And even though I would have changed a whole bunch of things that they ended up doing, everything that set this match up here at Money in the Bank was just played to perfection. And it delivered in a big way. It's my favorite match the two of them ever had, and like I said, one of the best matches in company history. And 6 years ago this week, on the July 13th, 2015 episode of Monday Night Raw from Atlanta, GA, it was the start of what WWE then referred to as the Divas Revolution, with the Raw debuts of Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and the reigning NXT Women's Champion at that time, Sasha Banks. They would quickly be paired off into groups. At the time, we had Team Bella, which consisted of Alicia Fox and the Bella Twins. We had Team Bad, Naomi, Tamina, and they put Sasha Banks with them. And Team PCB, Paige, Charlotte, and Becky Lynch. 3 groups that would all be broken up before the end of the year. Because it would not be WWE without breaking up a bunch of teams as quickly as possible. Even if it was the best, for the best in this case. Because Sasha Banks did not need to be paired off with Naomi and Tamina. These pairings were fucking weird to begin with. I think they were trying to give them rub by putting them together with main roster talents. Meanwhile, these women made their entrances, they made their debuts on this show, and from the moment they walked out, they were bigger stars than almost any of the other people who were in this segment, except maybe the Bellas. They didn't need them. But they were all introduced to the audience on this show by the creator of women's wrestling. All bow to the great Stephanie McMahon. What a visionary for women's wrestling she was. This, by the way, was all spurred on. This was the year, in February of that year, there was an infamous match on Raw. It was the Bella Twins against Paige and Emma. And the match went maybe 30 seconds. This was during an era where the divas, as they were called, they would be lucky to get 30 seconds. They'd be going out for a match and they would tell stories. They're in the gorilla position getting ready to go out for a match that maybe they were going to have 4 or 5 minutes for. And while they're in the gorilla position, they're basically being told to go home. It's like, oh, your match got cut. So counting entrances and everything, you're basically going to have an entrance and then the match within 20 seconds is going to be over. And this was every week. And then you're just like, well, I wonder why people don't give a shit about women's wrestling in this company, because the company didn't give a shit about women's wrestling in this company. They pretended that they did. They acted like they did, but they didn't. That's why I was running the Diva stopwatch gimmick that everybody, started doing the same thing. I started doing the whole Diva stopwatch thing and posting screenshots on my Twitter because it was comical. It's like they were trying to top themselves by breaking records for the shortest match every single week. Well, in this case, it really pissed off a lot of people, and the hashtag Give Divas a Chance started trending worldwide on Twitter. And if you want to get this company's attention, you got to talk their language. They speak the language of Twitter. They love trending. Don't know that it really means anything. Usually people trend for all the wrong reasons, if they say something controversial or if they fucking die. But in this case, Give Divas a Chance was trending. And that got the company's attention. And they started to think about, okay, maybe we ought to actually improve things here. We ought to give the people what they want. AJ Lee had made public comments refuting things that Stephanie McMahon was saying. That got a lot of press. So it all built to this moment where they called up some fresh blood, some fresh talent. And by WrestleMania the following year, the Divas title, the Butterfly Belt, was no more. It was now the Women's Championship, and you had Charlotte and Becky and Sasha tearing it up in the ring at WrestleMania. And it really was a changing of the guard. I mean, they love to use words like revolution and stuff, and I know that sounds ridiculous, but for this company, it really was. It really was the start of a revolution of sorts. an overhaul in the women's division and in women's wrestling and how they treated it in this company. And it started with these three women, Charlotte, Becky, and Sasha. And that is this week in wrestling history.